Y'all know Vietnam War was ugly, but there's a side of it that'll make your jaw hit the floor, because at one point in this war, American enlisted men were taking out their own officers at a rate 20 times higher than any war in U.S. history. And now you're going to see why. Fragging is the deliberate killing or attempted killing of a superior by one of their own soldiers. We're talking about an officer, an NCO, somebody in your chain of command, and one of the boys under him decides that son of a bitch needs to go. The word comes from the fragmentation grenade, which was the go-to weapon for getting it done. And you're going to hear why that was in a minute. Now, this became such a goddamn problem in Vietnam that in parts of the country, American officers were more afraid of their own enlisted men than they were of the actual enemy. Think about that for a second. You're a lieutenant in the United States Army, you're in a combat zone, and the thing that's got you losing sleep ain't Charlie out in the tree line. It's a pissed off 19-year-old draftee sleeping 10 feet from you who's been counting the days since you showed up and started making his life worse. But the act itself, killing your own leaders, that didn't start in Vietnam. Hell no. Soldiers have been murdering commanders they hated for as long as men have been dumb enough to put other men in charge of them. Y'all have probably heard the World War I story, right? Some sergeant who'd been getting his men killed left and right through sheer recklessness and incompetence. And one of his own boys just walked up behind and pulled the pin on Mills' bomb and dropped it right down the back of the man's trousers. Investigation came around, and wouldn't you know it, nobody saw a thing. Nobody heard nothing. Whole unit must have been looking the other way at the exact same moment. Funny how that works when everybody agrees on the outcome. So what changed in Vietnam wasn't the idea of fragging, but how much of it there was. Just so you can grasp the picture, in World War I, the United States put over 4.7 million men in uniform, and out of that entire force, fewer than 370 cases of violence against superiors ever made it to court-martial. That's roughly one case for every 12,700 servicemen. And that ratio held pretty steady through World War II and through Korea. These were isolated events, one guy hitting his breaking point with one officer, personal grudges, individual snaps, and the military handled them quick and buried them quiet. Then Vietnam came along and blew that ratio straight to hell. The first known fragging incidents popped up in 1966, but they were scattered, rare. Didn't look like much of a pattern yet. It wasn't until after '68, after the Tet Offensive kicked the legs out from under every lie the brass had been telling about how great the war was going. By 1969, the rate of attacks on superiors jumped to about 1 for every 3,300 servicemen. By 1971, 1 for every 570. That's more than 20 times higher than anything in any previous American war. And y'all got to understand, those numbers only counted attacks with explosive devices. They didn't count shootings, stabbings, or any of the other creative ways soldiers found to get rid of leaders they wanted dead, because those deaths were damn near impossible to separate from regular combat casualties. You know how it is, somebody catches around during a firefight. Well, who's going to prove it came from behind them and not from the tree line? A captured enemy weapon chambered in a different caliber could mask it real easy. Or maybe it's just a friendly fire incident that conveniently catches the most hated officer in the whole company right in the back of the skull. You know, these things happen, right? Those kinds of deaths were invisible, and nobody investigated them because there was nothing to investigate. At its peak, in 1971, a fragging was going down roughly every single day. No American war before or since has come anywhere near that. So why the frag grenade specifically? Why not just shoot the bastard? Well, first off, individual grenades didn't carry serial numbers. There was zero way to trace one back to a specific soldier. Second, the explosion wiped out everything that could have been evidence. The casing shattered into 100 pieces. Any fingerprints on it were long gone. And unlike a bullet, there ain't no ballistic markings, no rifling patterns, no spent shell casings to match back to anybody's weapon. An investigator showing up after a fragging had basically nothing to work with. But the third reason is that you didn't have to be anywhere near the damn thing when it went off. You could lob that thing through an air vent at 2 in the morning, roll it under a bunk while everybody's asleep, rig it up as a booby trap with a tripwire across the doorway, and set the whole thing up and be sitting 100 yards away with your buddies playing cards and building yourself a real nice alibi when the boom hits. And getting your hands on one was about as hard as walking to the corner store. Ammo supply in Vietnam was a joke. crates of grenades just sitting around in ammo bunkers, and any soldier could grab a couple, stuff them in his pockets without anybody noticing or giving a single solitary damn. The Army eventually tried locking down grenade access in rear areas around 1971, and at one point they actually stopped issuing them altogether, which, I mean, that right there tells you how bad things had got. Didn't fix the thing though, because Vietnam had a thriving black market where you could buy whatever the hell you wanted. Now the big question, why did all this happen? Why Vietnam specifically and not any other American war? Because Vietnam cooked up a combination of conditions that had never existed together before, and I reckon they never will again. It all started falling apart with the Tet Offensive in 1968. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched coordinated attacks all across the entire country at the same damn time, hitting major cities, military bases, and they even got into the U.S. Embassy compound in Saigon. Now here's the thing, militarily, Tet was a loss for the North Vietnamese. They got chewed up bad and didn't hold a single major objective. But that didn't matter one bit, because what Tet really blew to pieces was the lie. For years, the brass and the politicians back in Washington had been going on TV telling everybody the war was going wonderful, the enemy was on the ropes, just a little more time and we'll wrap this thing up. And then the American public flips on the news and sees Viet Cong fighters shooting their way into the embassy. Once that credibility shattered, it was gone for good. Public opinion swung hard against the war. And the soldiers in the field, a whole mess of them draftees who never wanted to be there in the first place. And they absorbed that same bitterness like a sponge. Then Nixon rolled in and managed to make the whole thing worse.
In this administration, we are Vietnamizing the search for peace.
Starting in 1969, he began pulling troops out under this policy called Vietnamization, which was basically, hey, we're going to hand the fighting over to the South Vietnamese and bring the boys home. Now that sounds great on paper, right? Problem is, in practice, it was absolute poison for morale, because every single soldier still stuck in country was now asking himself the most dangerous question a soldier can ask. Why the hell am I still here dying for a war we've already decided to quit? And the withdrawal dragged on and on for years. And every month it continued, the men still left behind got angrier, more resentful, and more dangerous. Not to the enemy, to their own damn officers. Vietnam was hated back home, and the draft system was widely seen as rigged against poor kids and minorities, while the rich boys got their college deferments and sat it out. Drug use was another catastrophe. 88% of soldiers convicted of fragging were intoxicated when they did it. Racial tensions were ripping the Army apart from the inside. And on top of all of that, the military had lowered its entry standards just to keep the ranks full enough to fight a war nobody wanted to fight. On the officer side, the Army chopped down the officer candidate school to crank out lieutenants faster. And these boys got the nickname 90-day wonders, which, let me tell you, that wasn't a compliment. A whole lot of them were poorly trained and had no clue what they were walking into when they got handed a platoon of guys who'd been in the shit for months. Roughly half of all Army captains at the time didn't even have a college degree. But the thing that probably destroyed more units than any single policy was the rotation system. In Vietnam, individual soldiers rotated in and out on 12-month tours. And the officers, get this, officers typically only served 6 months in a combat command before sliding over to a cushy staff position. So no unit ever stayed together long enough to build any real trust that hold a fighting force together when things get ugly. The grunts were constantly getting saddled with brand new leaders who didn't know them, didn't understand what they'd been through, and in way too many cases showed up with one thing on their mind: make a name for themselves before the clock ran out. Because here's the dirty secret. The Army's evaluation system rewarded aggression and punished caution. A lieutenant or captain who kept his head down, avoided unnecessary contact, and brought all his men home alive but didn't have sexy numbers on his performance report, that guy was hurting his career. But the officer who racked up confirmed kills, led aggressive patrols into contested territory, and got himself a Bronze Star or a Silver Star pinned to his chest, that man was going places. So you had this constant revolving door of fresh officers dropping into units full of men who'd already been in country for months, who'd already carried friends out of the bush in body bags. And these new guys didn't know the men, didn't know the ground, didn't know shit about how things actually worked out there, but they had 6 months to build a combat record that'd make them look good. Some of them hit the ground running and immediately started pushing for aggressive ops, ordering patrols into areas the experienced guys knew were kill zones, volunteering the unit for missions nobody needed to go on. And the guys who actually had to strap on their gear and walk into those kill zones, they noticed, they remembered, and eventually some of them decided to solve the problem themselves. Now here's where it gets real interesting, because Vietnam fragging developed its own system, like an actual step-by-step process, almost like a ritual, and it gave the target officer a chance to get the message before things went all the way. Step one, somebody pulls the safety pin out of a fragmentation grenade and leaves it on the officer's bunk, just a pin, sitting right there on his pillow when he walks in. That's a message, plain and simple. Change your behavior or this is coming your way. Step two, they escalate. A whole grenade shows up in the officer's quarters with his name painted right on it. Pin's still in, so it ain't gonna blow. But brother, if you're the guy reading your own name on a frag, you ain't sleeping too good that night. Step three, a smoke grenade or a tear gas grenade goes off in or near where the officer sleeps. Still not lethal, but now they're proving they can get to you anytime they want. In step four is the live fragmentation grenade. No more warnings. And y'all gotta understand what this did to the chain of command, because once an officer knows his own men might blow him up in his sleep, he is done as a leader. He ain't gonna enforce drug regulations, and he ain't gonna push for patrols. He ain't gonna do a damn thing that might piss off the wrong private. And that is exactly what happened across huge chunks of the American force in Vietnam. Officers they checked out, they looked the other way on everything. Drug use, didn't see it. Guys sleeping on guard duty, not my problem. In some units, officers had to sit down and negotiate with their enlisted men, like a damn labor dispute, just to get consent before going on patrol. And that had real deadly consequences that went the other direction too. Some bases got overrun because soldiers were sleeping on guard. Nobody was fortifying the perimeter, nobody was patrolling, nobody was doing the damn thing they were supposed to do to keep the base secure. And here's the part that messes with what most folks assume about fragging. Y'all probably picture this happening out in the jungle somewhere. Guys on the front lines snapping under combat stress. But no, roughly 80% of fragging incidents happen in rear area base camps, not on the front lines. 90% went down within 3 days of an argument. A huge chunk of this was rear echelon violence. You got guys with weapons and way too much free time, loaded on substances we can't even get into here on YouTube. Getting into beefs that back home would have ended with somebody getting punched in the mouth. But in Vietnam, with a crate of grenades sitting 50 yards away in a barely guarded ammo bunker, that fist fight turned into a murder. Now some of the real stories out of this are just, man, they're gut-wrenching. Take Private Gary Hendricks. Hendricks fell asleep on guard duty. Now, look, falling asleep on guard is serious. I ain't gonna sugarcoat that. In a combat zone that can get people killed. But Sergeant Richard Tate found him, and depending on which account you read, either grabbed Hendricks by the throat or just absolutely tore into him verbally. Either way, chewed him out hard. A few hours later, Hendricks walked over to Tate's bunker and tossed the frag through the air vent. It landed on Tate's stomach. 2 other sergeants sleeping nearby got wounded. Well, you can imagine what happened to Tate. You know, he was a father of 3 with 3 weeks left on his tour. When they asked Hendricks what happened, he said he dropped a frag into Tate's bunker and hoped he killed every lifer inside. They convicted him and sentenced him to death, one of the very few death sentences ever handed down for fragging. He got knocked down to life with hard labor. However, he was paroled in November of 1980 after about 8.5 years. Went to college after that, got a postgraduate degree. And I swear I ain't making this up, he majored in criminology. The most famous fragging case of the whole damn war is even worse. A grenade came through an open window into an officer billet, and the blast killed First Lieutenant Thomas Delwo, 24 years old, who was scheduled to leave Vietnam the next day. It also killed Second Lieutenant Richard Harlan, also 24. And Delwo wasn't even the intended target. He was just sleeping in the wrong place at the wrong time. A third officer got wounded. They charged a private named Billy Dean Smith, a 24-year-old black draftee, with both murders. All the victims were white. Smith had been openly critical of the war, called it unjust and racially motivated, and he had a stack of disciplinary issues. He admitted he was high that night, but swore he didn't do it. The case blew up into a national flashpoint. The trial was an absolute circus, and in the end, the defense tore the forensic evidence to shreds, and Smith was acquitted. The man had spent nearly 2 years in solitary confinement for something he didn't do. Nobody else was ever charged, while the murders of Delwo and Harlan remain unsolved to this day. Then you got the bounty system, which, I mean, just sit with that phrase for a second. American soldiers pooling their money together to put a price on an American officer's head. The most infamous case came out to the Battle of Hamburger Hill. Lieutenant Colonel Weldon Honeycutt, with infamous call sign Blackjack, ordered his men uphill 937 in repeated frontal assaults against dug-in North Vietnamese positions. Over 10 days of absolute hell, somewhere between 56 and 72 Americans were killed, depending on the source, and over 370 were wounded. They took the hill, and then they abandoned it about 2 weeks later. It had no strategic value. All those men dead and mangled for nothing. The soldiers were understandably beyond furious, and as you can imagine, several attempts were made on Honeycutt's life. He survived, though, kept his career going, which I reckon that tells you something about how the Army handled accountability in those days. Between 1969 and 1972, there were at least 904 documented fragging incidents involving explosive devices, 99 men killed, and Lord knows how many more died from other methods that were flat impossible to tell apart from enemy action. Vietnam holds that record, and it almost certainly always will. And here's the thing, the fragging epidemic didn't end because the Army figured out how to fix it. It ended because the war ended and the draft ended. The shift to an all-volunteer military announced in January of 1973 is directly tied to what happened in Vietnam. And since Vietnam, only 2 fragging cases have gone to court-martial in American wars.